is not legal or psychological advice. Listening does not create a professional relationship with Split Up or any guests. Lonnie and Robert are only licensed in the state of Arizona. For legal or mental health concerns, please consult a licensed professional in your state. Guest identities may be changed for privacy.
Hi, and welcome to Split Up. Today we have Robert and me, Lonnie Sheldon, and we have Annette Burns and Nicole Segueiro-Stoutner, and of course, Robert DiCarlo. So Robert, you want to introduce everyone?
Yeah, I'd love to. So
Perfect.
we've got Annette Burns here, and Annette has practiced law in Arizona since 1984. She specializes in the practice of family law and focuses on acting as a mediator, arbitrator, family law master, and parenting coordinator in family law cases. Her background and experience includes 40 years of client representation in family court. Annette is also a certified family law specialist by the State Bar of Arizona and has been awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award for her work in family law. Annette, we're so happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. It's great to be here.
Thanks. We also have with us Nicole Segueiro-Stoutner, who is a highly respected Arizona family law attorney as well. She's a mediator and parenting coordinator with extensive experience in divorce, custody, and complex family court matters. A former Maricopa County Superior Court judicial officer and pro tem, Nicole combines legal experience and expertise with compassion to help families navigate high conflict situations. Nicole regularly teaches and presents on trial advocacy, domestic violence, child custody, cultural competence, and mental health and family law. Nicole is also the co-founder of Sheldon and Stoutner. She's fluent in Spanish and Italian and recognized as a super lawyer and 40 under 40 honoree. And of course, an international author, having co-written Co-Parenting by Design, the definitive guide for divorced or separated parents. Nicole, thank you so much for being here with us. Love the book.
All right, so here's the book. I just want to give it a plug. Nicole and Annette wrote this book, and it's really designing a really great co-parenting plan and a parenting plan. And so we're not really talking about this today. We're talking about this kind of, I don't know, it's a system that you guys came up with called Spark, which is so awesome. And I asked them to come on here and talk about it because I think it's really helpful to give, I don't know, parents and lawyers almost like a rubric to follow, something to think about when you're creating your plan and making sure that sort of everything hits that spark. So can you tell me a little bit about Spark, what it is?
Would you like to take that, Nicole?
Sure. Spark, I think I'd call it a method. I think that's what we were thinking. But the idea is it's a way to make sure that your parenting plans are their very best. And it's a way to sort of check through and think about the provisions in your parenting plans and make them work for the parties. If you're an attorney, make them work for yourself if you're a self-represented litigant in the best way that they can and in your children's best interests.
So what does it stand for?
SPARK stands for sustainable, precise, attainable, reduces conflict, and kid focus. So those are kind of the 5 points of SPARK.
And so when you create a parenting plan, do you kind of implement that whole method on every piece of the parenting plan?
Go ahead, Annette.
Yeah, I would definitely say you need to think about these points in every part of the plan. And that's what we really want people to do with their parenting plans, not just treat them like they're, the terms of service we see online where nobody reads them and you just sign at the bottom. You need to really think about every part of a parenting plan and not just see it as a boilerplate document. It is your family's document. And so if talking about Spark and saying go through the SPARK on all these provisions makes somebody think about how it applies to their family, then we've done our job. That's the purpose.
And I agree. So when I looked at Annette gave me a PowerPoint that she had taught, that her and Nicole had taught on. And when I looked at it, it brought a little bit to mind my divorce, and my very worst parenting plan that I ever created was my own. And so I think really for parents, doing it on your own too. So besides the fact I think every family law attorney should use this, when I was using it when I did my own parenting plan, had I really focused on each one of these things for each paragraph, I think it would have helped so much instead of really just going, oh, we're getting along. That's fine. Of course you get along until you don't.
Right.
And then that's when, the shit hits the fan and you need to make sure that you have good parenting plans. So,
And well, we understand that when you're doing the parenting plan, you're in a really bad place in your life and you have 100 things going on, and it's easier to just say, give me a form and I'll sign it. We get that. So we really, the combination of the book and the Spark method, we're trying to make it easier for people to do a better job at that point.
so
I
what,
think,
what
oh,
inspired
go
you
ahead.
guys to do it? Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I think we're like a culture of templates. Everybody, there's all these templates
Yeah.
online. You can go on Chat GPT and ask it to write you a parenting plan. You can download, 500 different types of parenting plans, and not all of them are good, you know? And I think not all of them are customized or specific for your family and your children's needs. And I think that's one of the advantages of Spark too, is it kind of asks you to say, okay, you've got all the material you need, but which one is right for you, and which of these, and thinking about the provisions that you choose to put in your parenting plan to make it work for your family.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Annette, you had mentioned too how, when parents go into this process, it's so emotionally charged, they may just want to like sign off on the dotted line. I really like the idea of frameworks. And Nicole, you also mentioned, you can use ChatGPT. There's templates out there. I like the idea of a really well thought out framework that will help parents really sort of take some of the emotion out of it and be able to go step by step. So I'm wondering if you can help our listeners understand, this method. And I know the first is, sustainability. So can you give an example of what is not sustainable versus language about maybe the same thing that could be sustainable?
When I think of sustainable, we think look to the future as much as possible, and realizing that your children may be, preschool age when you're doing this plan, but try to look for the future. We still see some plans that say the parents will spend holidays together, or that they'll celebrate Christmas together, or that let's say Christmas Day is split in half and the child would be with parent A until 2 p.m. and parent B from 2 to 8 p.m. And that's not always very sustainable as the kids get older. I mean, it's certainly not sustainable to spend holidays together. These parents are going to repartner. And the new partner or spouse is not always going to be happy about, oh, we're spending Christmas with your ex. So that might be great for the first couple of years, but it doesn't last. So that's just one example of sustainable. Another is.
I just have to butt in real quick because
Sure,
I'm looking at Robert and laughing. Because we are going to have a podcast with Robert and his ex on.
Perfect.
They're doing very good co-parenting, but sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I think that's
Robert
wonderful.
might not last.
I think that's wonderful. I mean, but the problem is the plans we see are the ones that didn't work out very well, unfortunately, because we're all attorneys. The ones that work out, they don't need lawyers, so we don't see them.
Well, I also like the idea of aspirational, plans versus what is going to be sustainable. So you can aspire to do that long term, but the language needs to be sustainable.
And I think that goes to the point. So, parenting plans should be like fluid, dynamic things to me, and to some degree, I think, because we should at least build in the ability for these plans to be changed. And how would you resolve disputes, or how do you resolve changes as, the children change too? What my child was when she was 5 is totally different than who she is now.
Right.
And I think also having a strong dispute resolution and maybe building in certain triggers or things that would allow for the plan to change is a good example of sustainability. As an example, I think one you and I, Annette, have talked about is, do we really need Easter and Halloween for a 16-year-old? It sounds great when you've got a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old, but maybe we build into the plan that at 16, these holidays are going to be optional, or or they're not going to be needed. And that's an example of sustainable language.
Right. And what we're not saying is that if you have a 3-year-old that you should decide what you're going to do when it's time to get a driver's license. That's not reasonable or sustainable at this point. By the time this kid gets a driver's license, there could be flying cars. So we're not saying that, but you really should think about how we're going to get along to talk about those things as the kid gets older. So there's just certain things that just don't stand the test of time.
The best example is the one that we always talk about, which is first right of refusal. I think
Oh,
that is an
please.
example of a provision that is not sustainable. That's my go-to.
Right.
So.
Yeah, we see so many, at least on the evaluative end, we see so many problems rising out of that one provision in parenting plans, the right of first refusal. And I know it's intended to be really helpful, but in practice, it ends up creating so many conflicts.
It sounds so fantastic. It sounds so easy. Oh, of course the other parent will be asked first. Oh my God. And then you find out it's going to be used to deprive that person of legitimate parenting time. It's going to be used to deprive the child of access to his or her cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, next door neighbor, whatever. And it's just the way it's used in practice has just turned out so badly in some cases.
I
Well,
think
that
we
might,
should probably define it. I'm not
Yeah,
sure if
why don't
everyone
you
knows
say what it
what it
is,
means.
Nicole?
yeah,
I'm
that'd be
sorry.
helpful.
It occurred to me that maybe that's a term that not everyone would know, but what it means is essentially a provision where if the child is not going to be cared for by one parent, maybe it's because of, an unexpected vacation or a business trip, or maybe I've seen provisions where it's because of work or something, that the other parent then would have the opportunity to be the first person to provide care. They have the first right of refusal of care for the child. I most commonly I see them for like work trips. So if you're not going to be able to take care of the child for these 8 hours or overnight because you have to travel for work, then I get the first right of refusal to care for the child as the other parent.
Right.
Yeah, and that
Annette,
actually
did you
might be
used
a
to call
great,
that the stalker clause? Sorry. Did you
go
used to
ahead.
call that the stalker clause, Annette?
Oh, I have often called that the stalker clause. Yes.
Say more about that. What does that mean in that?
What it means is I've seen these first right of caretaking or first right of refusal clauses that are as short as 2 or 4 hours. So that means that the custodial parent literally goes and plays a round of golf or goes to a short meeting or something.
Yeah.
The non-custodial parent is stalking to see, has he been away from her for 120 minutes? I'm going to go grab her. And this sounds unbelievable, I know, but every family law attorney knows of cases that have done this. You're spying on the custodial parent to make sure they're not away from the kid 1 minute longer than that first right of refusal clause.
Well, this
And
might be actually an excellent segue into the next part of your method, and that is around precision. And so when you have precise language like 2 hours or 4 hours, can you talk a little bit about what you mean with precision?
sure, I can. When we want things precise, we really want things more than just exchanges will be done through school, drop-offs and pickups, because the problem is not every day is a school day. So we want precise language about when a child's going to be picked up, especially if they're not in school, and when parenting time starts. So instead of just saying one parent has the child Monday morning to Wednesday morning, you say Monday morning at 8 a.m. to Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. That makes it clear who's responsible for the child during the school day, and it makes it clear what time you're to do the exchange if it's not a school day for some reason, sick child or otherwise. So that kind of precision, even if everybody knows, oh yeah, we're talking about they throw out acronyms, a 5225 plan, a 223 plan. Yeah, you throw out acronyms and they work until they don't. So, but if you have specific times of day, there's not much room for disagreement. That's one example of precision.
I think a lot of the court parenting plan templates are guilty of not being precise, in my
Yes,
opinion.
yes,
They'll say things like equally divide the breaks, and you all
right,
see that even in attorney drafted parenting plans, and that is a problem because what is the break? Is the break Monday through Friday? So are we exchanging if we're equally dividing it on Wednesday? Is the break really Friday? When they get out of school to Monday morning when they go back to school. And it's that kind of detail that is what we need you to see, need you to put in a parenting plan when we're talking about precision. It's about having that detail,
right.
having those times and the dates and understanding that holidays are different too, so a 4th of July definition probably wouldn't be the same as the definition for Christmas, as an example.
Yeah.
Well, and even with the sustainability of being that precise too. For example, if you define the break as the academic calendar, but in 4 years the kids change schools or move to a different
Right.
school district, that could affect how those uh, precise definitions play out. So you have to think short and long term.
Exactly. Or you could have three kids and they're in two or three different schools with different
Right.
calendars. That happens all the time. So, and then it could be something easy like, oh, on the child's birthday, the parent who doesn't have the child gets to see her for 3 hours. Well, what 3 hours? What does that mean? What if it's a school day? The kids barely got 3 hours of waking time other than school hours. So
I
that has been a
dislike
big
that
problem.
clause so much. I dislike that clause. So
Oh, I
that's
do
just,
too, because when you think about the poor kid being trucked around town on his or her birthday, oh, I majorly dislike that clause, and not just because it's not precise.
and then
Well,
you get a kid, someone's giving the kid, you know, cake and ice cream at 4 o'clock right before dinner, and then the kid doesn't want dinner
Right.
and they end up fighting
That
there. And
that one falls in the K, the kid focused. We'll get to that one.
yeah,
A lot of these things fall in more than one spark category.
one easy way, in my opinion, to check if a parenting plan is precise is I prefer the use of days over the term week. Because a week can be defined as Sunday to Saturday. It can be defined, as Monday to Friday. So if you see a vacation provision, for example, that says, okay, each parent will have a week of vacation, I would say go ahead and change that and make that each parent will have 7 days of vacation, if that's the intent. So that's an easy way when you're going through your provisions to look for precision and make a change.
There you go. There you go. I
all
like
right,
that.
so let's talk about the A then. What is the A?
Attainability.
The A is attainable, yes. And okay, one example of that is, well, a lot of times we will see boilerplate provisions, and Robert, I'm going to point the finger at you now because a lot of these provisions come from evaluators' reports or therapists' recommendations. And it could be something like the parents should endeavor to make the routines at each household as close as possible, including nutrition, bedtimes, discipline, etc. Does that sound familiar at all to you, Robert?
Absolutely. And when I think about it as a psychologist who should be operationally defining terms, that what does that even mean? How do you enforce that? How do you measure that? It's very problematic.
And I'm sorry to pick on you because it's a wonderful thought. And I think we all know if a child could have that kind of complete uniformity between different households, I'm sure that child would do great. It's just not attainable in most places. And what it leads to is power struggles between the parents.
And
You're
and I think
supposed to
that's
be
exactly,
hollow.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I see that a lot with the judges, especially. I think a lot of the parenting plans that I see the judges implement as not sometimes being attainable.
Correct.
Because I
Correct.
don't think they've considered all of, there's so many factors that could affect attainability, like the distance between the parties' homes. So a 6 a.m. exchange time might be great, except if
Oh,
the parties live 30 miles apart, it might not be. And
exactly.
that's a big piece of attainability is just, what are the parents' work hours? Where are the children being exchanged? Does this plan make sense financially for the family? If we all agree that you will always use a busy bee childcare provider, that may be not financially feasible for some families, because they're expensive. So
Right.
maybe we shouldn't have a provision that has that.
Well, and it also butts up against this concept of autonomy of households. Each parent should be able to parent freely how they wish to parent. And maybe some of those parenting values aligned during the relationship or the marriage, but post separation, they may have adopted different, household policies, different bedtimes, different routines. And certainly there can be disruption between the households when the kids transition. But there may be other ways to address that than having this really precise language that's not attainable.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better, Robert. I mean, and children do benefit by having access to different parenting styles, especially older children, I would think. But that was just a fantastic way of saying it. There has to be recognition that both parents are offering good things to the child.
Right.
I think that's like a fundamental part of when you begin to co-parent is understanding that each parent are not going to parent in the same way.
Right.
And I think a lot of people have a very hard time even getting over that initial consideration. It's
And
Right.
not going to be the way it was.
And it's
and
understandable.
Right. And
Yeah.
spoiler alert, you don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it, right? But you've got to do
Right.
something else with that sort of negative energy.
Mhm.
There has to be a level of acceptance and understanding that you don't have to agree that you should parent the same way.
Exactly. But I
I
get
think
why it's hard for people because a lot of times during the parents' relationship, one person was in charge of everything.
Right.
So I do understand it's hard to transition away from that. So,
that's what
And
I was going to
they,
say. That
yeah.
was hard for me, for
of course,
sure, because I was doing everything the way I wanted to do it, and it was perfectly fine at the time. But then, divorce comes and somebody's got 50% of the time, and now the way I was doing it is not appropriate, and it's going to be done a different way. And it's hard to lose that control. I mean,
I
I
can
think it's,
understand that.
it's really, that was the hardest thing, I think, is you lose control over the caring for your kids. And I think, listen, I'm one of those people that's like, yeah, I want 50-50 because I don't want them 50% of the time. Like, not that I want to say it that way, but you need that break, right? You want to have a life
Right.
also. And it's hard to, um, it,
It's
it's,
hard to
it,
change.
it's hard
Change
to
is hard.
change that. Yeah. So, but it's doable, people. It's doable. It's just, you gotta accept that there's more than one way to do something, and that your way is not necessarily the only way, even if you think it's the best.
Right.
Probably is.
Attainable. If only. If only.
And I think we had some kind of examples of unattainable provisions. And one that I think I threw out to you, Annette, when we were talking about it was I have seen these provisions in parenting plans, and I know Robert might laugh at this, where they require the parents to have a weekly dinner together with the child.
Oh my gosh.
So they're separated parents. They have to have a dinner, mom, dad, and child. And I just, you know, and maybe it sounds great. It does sound great. That sounds awesome. They can all talk and be together, but
Right.
that is not an attainable position, like it's not sustainable either, but it's not
Right.
a good provision.
Could I offer something though, just because this is such a downer discussion about how hard it is, something that would be attainable, I think. We're not going to be able to match what they're doing in both households, but let's consider the thought of rules about devices and internet use and
Mm,
games in each household, which is a huge issue in co-parenting. What might be attainable between the parents is that they will exchange with each other. These are the rules in my household. These are the hours I let them be on the internet. This is when the phones get shut down for the night. I don't let the kids take the phones in their bedrooms overnight. They stay in the kitchen plugged in. They get 4 hours of screen time a day on the weekend, things like that. That would be attainable to tell the other parent. And I think exchanging that information is better than just not knowing what's going on in the other parent's house. And you're not trying to control it. You're just saying, I'd like to know what's going on in your house, and here's what's going on in mine. I think that's attainable.
yeah, absolutely. And again, just a reminder to listeners and people going through this. Your parenting plan is sort of the default position. You can deviate from that by agreement. So
Right,
I love this
right,
idea of having shared values that you can agree on, but they don't necessarily have to lock up your plan. So when I
right.
work with co-parents and when we're doing co-parenting work, sometimes I encourage them to develop a joint family charter. And it's sort of the values that guide things like maybe you do want to aspire to have meals together, once a week as a family. I don't know that that should be in your parenting plan, though, because
Right,
the conditions could change and make that a very uncomfortable or even hostile situation in some situations and contexts.
right.
I
Exactly.
like the idea of a joint family charter. I was thinking about that concept. In a general sense, I mean, and maybe it's dynamic. It changes over time because
Totally.
those could change,
Yeah, it
but I
should be
like that idea.
modifiable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my kids are in their 30s, and I'm not sure I could write the charter even now. So you guys are way ahead of me.
But you think about what's important to you as a family, and it doesn't mean you're controlling the other person, but
Right,
if religion's very important to you, then maybe that's in your charter. Or if, academics is super important and that should be the priority, maybe that's something that everyone agrees is a priority for the families, even when they're apart and co-parenting.
Well, I think one of the really cool and surprising things is when I ask the parents to write their values down separate from each other and we compare them, they're not all that out of alignment. And so you
Yeah.
can use that as a starting point to help them develop some shared ideas and maybe some agreements that they can use across the households. Again, not locked down on a parenting plan, but here are the things we're going to try to accomplish. We may not hit the mark precisely, but this is what we're after.
Yeah.
Very good. I'm learning a lot, guys.
Yeah,
Yeah, I like
I'm
that.
just gonna say, for the people out there listening that can do that, great, go ahead and do that. I think the people that we see are not the people who can typically do that. And I can tell you, I thought I had a very low conflict divorce, and there's no way in hell we could have done that, because I can tell you my ex would have been like, I don't give a shit what your charter wants. Like, I'm not paying attention to that. And I can guarantee that's what I would have heard. But there's so many people who aren't high conflict that can do that. So I just think it's just,
And that's a great point, Lonnie. Anybody listening, if you can't do that, don't beat yourself up.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's just the way it is. Move on. Let's
Yeah.
go to the rest of the provisions.
Well, and sometimes that parallel, we call it parallel co-parenting, and sometimes that has its time and place too. It doesn't mean it will always be that way. Again, you can aspire for something greater in the future, but sometimes that's very protective and necessary to help reduce and manage conflict, which I think is another part of your plan and your framework around the R piece, reducing conflict.
Right, right. And in writing the book, the whole first section of the book, Nicole and I really wanted to focus on not, what's the word I want? Not demonizing parallel parenting. Thank you, Lonnie, and not demonizing parallel parenting that you just mentioned, Robert. It's a thing. It's a method. It can be a good thing. It can be a transitional phase. Some
And it
people
doesn't
think
have to be
it's
all or nothing. Like you can incorporate pieces of it,
Yeah,
and maybe
absolutely.
this works and that. And I think people get it in their mind like, I want a parallel parenting plan. And I tell my clients when I say
yeah,
that's not a thing.
right,
Like,
right.
yeah.
But it's certainly not. It's not a failure either, even if you need to do that for a while. And that was one of our goals in writing this, and that's why the whole
Yeah.
first section talks about co-parenting and specifically parallel co-parenting. So.
I know,
Yeah.
it gives me so many questions. And Nicole, Annette and I did a podcast on her book. Nicole and I are going to do one on their book also, because there are so many questions like that in what you're adding. So stay tuned for that too, but also
Thanks.
check out their book because it's super helpful and they give really great examples. And I've asked Annette to create more samples and to put them on our website. So Nicole, you also create more samples because they're fun to read and they're super helpful.
We did some, it's the back and forth.
Oh, okay.
Where
Yeah.
we did disagreements about different things. There's a few examples in the book, but we could do a lot more about, there are two sides to every story.
I'll say that I'm not always on that side. Sometimes I took that side for our discussions.
Right.
I want to be clear about that.
Yeah, the next part of Spark is reducing conflict, and that has everything to do with co-parenting.
And encouraging respect. So we kind of, it's, respect, reducing conflict and encouraging respect, 2 R's. We just didn't we didn't want to make it a double R.
Correct.
But, I think that's so important. It goes back to what we talked about kind of a little bit before, in that respecting each parent as a parent and as somebody that is providing something valuable to the child in their parenting. And you can do that in the way that you write your parenting plan provisions too, recognizing the value that each parent brings and what they, and respecting their time with the children.
Yes.
So.
And reducing conflict has a lot to do with how the parents communicate with each other, which could be just being nicer in their communications and their emails, or it could be restricting the amount and frequency and length of their communications. It could be switching them from nasty telephone calls where everybody ends up yelling at each other to once a week emails that are just to the point, business-like. Here's what's going on with the kids, blah, 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 blah. Here's the schedule. And really nothing to fight about because you're not picking on the other parent. So that's what we were talking about with both respect and reducing conflict.
One of the things we touched on too in our discussions was, language that can create conflict in your parenting plan. So And I think we both feel really strong about this, Annette, but languages like reasonable, flexible, as agreed,
Yeah.
those conceptually are really good words to use, and you should be using them, but they're really hard to enforce, and they can actually create conflict because people will say, well, you're not reasonable.
Right.
Well,
Right.
what is reasonable?
Exactly.
And really kind of looking for words that don't that maybe are not enforceable in that way, and maybe are unnecessary or not helpful provisions in a
Right.
parenting plan.
Yeah, we're talking like lawyers now, but some of
Yeah.
these words like, well, it's reasonable, so this has to happen. It's kind of like best interests. You know how often when there's a conflict and both parents come at you and say, but this is in the best interest of the children. Like that decides it. It's over, it's done. I don't know
Yeah,
what the best interest of the children really means, and I can tell you there's dozens of law review articles that says most people don't know what it means. So,
Well, and language is so rooted in context too. So what's used in a legal context versus just sort of a lay
yeah,
context or in your
right,
co-parenting.
right.
And I'll just share an anecdote. And, this came from the great David Horowitz, who is a fantastic mediator and parenting coordinator and attorney. But I made the mistake in my own divorce process of using the word unreasonable. And I meant it from a very sort of what I viewed as a neutral standpoint. And he challenged me that that's actually an aggressive word in this context because it
Ah,
implies, well, I use the word reasonable, but the implication is the reverse of that, which is that you're
right.
suggesting the other person is unreasonable. So that is like a
right.
perfect example of how language can create conflict. Uh,
Exactly.
and yeah,
Exactly.
so
So an
So,
example of a provision, I mean, is the parties will not unreasonably withhold their consent for the child to travel. And I've
yes,
seen that in almost every parenting
everywhere,
plan. And what does
everywhere.
that mean? And it's exactly like you said, Robert. It doesn't really mean anything, and it also can actually cause conflict. It can become it's a loaded term.
right.
Is it
You know,
unreasonable for me to withhold consent for my child to travel if I truly believe this child will be uncomfortable or endangered
mhm.
or might get sick? Is that unreasonable of me? Who knows? Who knows? And just in talking about reducing conflict in parent communication, I'm sure you have already done podcasts and setups on BIF, but I'll just throw out the BIF word. And it is so common these days. I think when you ask Chat GPT about it, even Chat GPT knows what BIF is.
Cool.
But in communicating with your co-parent, be brief, be informative, be friendly, and be firm. And when you biff things, life is just better.
And
And
you're respectful.
we haven't done one on Biff. So if you want to do one on your Biff book that you wrote with Bill and
Ability.
I wish I had it with me.
Bill and Kevin,
Bill and
Oh,
Kevin.
look,
here.
she has it.
I usually have it, I have it somewhere. I think so. I've been
It's
taking these books with me so that I can mark up things that I want to quote so I can do social media quotes on them. And so I take them everywhere with me with all
right.
of the stuff that's going on.
Well,
And
the
so
best I can say is if you can clean up your co-parent communication and biff things, you will reduce conflict. I mean, you just have to because
since you guys mentioned the can't unreasonably withhold or their permission to travel, what language do you use in the say traveling out of the country?
We have more precise language than that. And I think Annette and I agree on this because we've discussed this.
yeah,
Something along the lines of the children can travel internationally with the parent, and then we may have some boundaries. The children cannot travel to level 3 or level 4 countries, and those are defined by the U.S. State Department. They actually have 4 levels of where they put countries in for safety of travel. And so if the children are going to be traveling to level 3 and level 4, they would require consent from the other parent. But otherwise, we kind of open the doors for level 1 and level 2. So examples of level 1 would maybe be Canada. I know Japan is a level 1. But level 3 would probably be Colombia, some other, countries where there may be some civil unrest.
right. To me, the hard one is level 2. That might require some thinking. And I can't name any level 2 countries right now. I'm certain that parts of Mexico are, and that's really
Sure, there's
pertinent to us.
parts of Mexico that are 3.
Oh, yeah, and higher. So to me, level 2 is the hard one. I personally favor, well, first of all, if the parents and the family has traditionally traveled to certain countries, I think that can be put in a plan and recognized. But I personally favor something like permission is not necessarily required to travel to Canada on a Caribbean cruise or on a Disney cruise. Because those do leave the country, and those are like the lowest level, and those are also the most likely for a parent to want to do with their kids. I mean, especially if the family has any Canadian connections. So I personally feel putting specifics like that and lumping it in with the domestic United States is a good idea. And that's precise, and it takes away some of the conflict.
And actually, level 2 country is an example is Italy, believe it or not. So that's
Oh.
one level up because there is some unrest there. But again, under the kind of language that we're talking about, the children would still be able to travel there
You're right.
without permission, but that is a level 2.
Well, and that's where, the history of the family and what they've done historically may come into play, as you mentioned, Annette. And in some of your materials, you talked about the precision in language between permission versus notice. And I think that's
Yes.
really critical. But when you do have these families that might historically be multinational families, that could really be weaponized if you
Yes.
block somebody from visiting maybe their primary family is in Mexico or Canada. These are big things that if you have those historical traditions or patterns in your travel, those need to be really carefully thought out about their sustainability and how precise you need to be for your particular plan.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is misused and weaponized more than you would think. That is true. And you just pointed out, Robert, I mean, we're not talking about not notifying. The parent who's not traveling is always going to be allowed to have all information about the travel, flights, where the children are staying, other important things about the travel. That's notice, but that's not permission.
And it makes sense just from a practical standpoint. If there was an emergency or something that happened, that parent needs to be able to respond appropriately. So,
And things happen all over the world. I mean, if you hear about an explosion in Italy and your child is traveling in Italy, you are entitled to know where your kid is right then.
You're going to want to know, are they in that
yeah.
city? Is that where they are? Yeah.
Exactly. So we recognize that, believe me.
So let's talk about, since we're on travel, and I know this is a little off of Spark, but since we're talking about travel, we're talking about international travel. I mean, I might as well throw out passports out there to talk about who's holding the passport, when do they get them back? Like, do you have any specific language you think that would help reduce conflict and be precise enough?
We do have some proposed language that's both precise and designed to reduce conflict. And sometimes if you've got more than one child, sometimes to even it out, you have to have each parent hold one passport. And that way they have to cooperate because someone always needs the other child's passport to travel with both kids. We've had other provisions where one parent will hold a passport for even numbered years, and every January they switch, and then the other parent holds them for the odd numbered years. That's if the parents have a need to feel equal in this, which a lot of parents do. And it very precisely defines who has the passports at any given time. So we've suggested things like that. Fortunately, in a lot of families, they can actually agree that one parent hangs on to the passports and turns them over when they need to. So it just depends what the family needs.
And it does come up a lot. I mean, children's passports have to be renewed every 5 years versus every 10.
Right.
There's an expense associated with them that you may need to address. And then, generally parents have to be together to apply for it unless they use the form, which one parent would have to notarize. So it's actually, Lonnie, I think it's a good point because it is an area where I see a lot of dispute and conflict.
Yeah.
And you see the people saying that they're married, or that they're filling it out incorrectly so that they can
Yes.
just do it without the other parent.
Right,
I get
right.
that a lot.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a federal offense.
It is, but I don't think
Yeah.
I can tell you I've seen it happen quite a bit, and I'm not sure I've ever seen anyone get in trouble for it. But but they should. I mean, I think it's up to that other parent. If that other parent wants to enforce that, it's
Yeah.
It can be a problem.
Well,
relying on
another
federal documents.
Yeah.
another thought, just to be forward thinking, what if you don't have passports at the time of the dissolution and something changes and a couple years later you want to get passports? So is that something you'd recommend some forward thinking on, that there may even be provisions in the parenting plan on how to obtain passports, even if they don't have one?
Definitely, definitely. And that's not something that is necessarily far off like a driver's license. In general, I think unless there's some specific problem, like a child's been kidnapped, in general, I think if one parent wants the kids to have passports, it's going to be granted by the court. If that parent's willing to go through the trouble of applying and pay for it, I think the other parent is going to be ordered to cooperate with it. And it would be much better if it's in the parenting plan that whichever parent wants to initiate will front the fees for the passport, go through all the trouble, the other parent will have to sign. And then if the other parent wants to use the passports in the future, I think they have to kick in for half the expense too. So, but yeah, that should be in there as far as even for a 2-year-old's parenting plan, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's talk about the kid focused.
So, I mean, in all things we do, the kids should be the
Yeah.
the focus. I mean, the parenting plan is for the kids, but what we're kind of getting at here is really thinking about what's best for the kids, maybe over what's best for the parents sometime.
Right.
And I will quote Annette, because I love this quote, but she always says, "Children are not timeshares." And I think we see that a lot. Parents always trying to get to equal. And I mean, unfortunately, our child support guidelines kind of lend itself to equality,
Yeah.
at least in Arizona. And so I think that's part of the reason they always want to get to equal. But we see these provisions where it's, everything is about making sure we have exactly equal time. And I have an example if you want to hear it, because this is an area that I feel really strongly about, but that I would not recommend using. Is that okay? Or do you want
Of
me to give
course.
you? Okay. So, parenting time days will be exactly equalized between the parents on a monthly basis. Should the existence of holiday or vacation time give a parent more days in a month than the other parent has, the schedule will be rebalanced to provide for an equal number of days between households. And
Can
I
you
don't
imagine?
love that provision's terrible.
Imagine. I've seen language, I don't know if that came from a court order, Nicole, but I've seen language in orders written by judges that is similar to that.
Mhm.
I don't know if that
Oh,
was
yeah.
written by a judge or the parties, but can you even imagine every month rebalancing? Oh, it's the 30th of June and it's supposed to be your day, but I was shorted one day, so it's mine.
I
Oh my
mean, talk
It's like
about
a
conflict
dividend that
producing.
carries over.
Yeah.
Right, right. Oh, can I save up all my days so I get the whole month of December?
Right, right. Well,
Yeah.
and doing this from a co-parenting coach or therapist end, it's so frustrating when co-parents come in and their major conflict is the imbalance of days, and the balance
Right,
of days, we're talking like maybe 7 days over the course of a year. And
right,
you're gonna pay the therapist an hourly rate and pay your attorneys and go to court or any of the other interventions that they may use because they're shorted 7 days. And,
right.
and that goes to this concept of your kids aren't timeshares. I guarantee you they're not going to be young adults being like, "Gosh, I really missed that 7 days with mom or dad." Right?
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
it doesn't translate to anything real.
yeah.
And
It's
it
like they have
creates so much conflict.
spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I sometimes, I'm a math person, so I sometimes put it in a math equation and say, you're literally fighting about 0.5%.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
And now 7 days would be what, like 2%.
It's a rounding error.
But
But it's the principle,
think about it
Lonnie.
that
It's the
way.
principle.
Exactly. It's
That's
about
what
Yeah.
the
they say.
parent. It's all about the parents.
Yeah.
And that's why we're talking about kid
Yeah.
focused. Those kind of discussions are not kid focused when you're counting days.
And when someone's taking days unreasonably, I can kind of see where you want to stop it. You want to nip that if you've got a parent who just continuously takes days wrongfully. So what do you think, like in that case, if there is a parent who just, is taking them wrongfully,
I'm
How to
not,
resolve the conflict, you mean? Or like, you
I mean, I
know,
think you need to resolve that conflict, right?
well, what do you mean by taking wrongfully? Do you mean the plan is
they're
poorly written?
they're
So,
violating
Yeah,
the parenting plan? Yeah, okay.
yeah, the plan might be poorly written, or um a parent might, I'm trying to think of, I know I have several examples. Again, poorly written, and somebody says, "Oh, well, they stay vacation, a couple of days longer." And so there's no way they're getting the kid back. So there's a violation of
yeah,
something
that
in there. And so somebody's like, "Oh, well,
Yeah.
I know I was supposed to come back this day, but we're having so much fun. We just want to stay an extra 4 days, and it's the other parent's
And they
days."
have the kid call too.
Right,
Please,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
mom, let me stay.
Oh,
Yeah.
I
yeah.
would I would ask you, Robert. I mean, before running into court and filing a contempt, because that's an option, what would you say would be the best way to like maybe bring that to the surface and find a resolution that's not litigation?
I mean, you really have to tap into the values of the parent and understand what is their underlying motivation. And sometimes they just want to express that they want to set certain boundaries with their co-parent. And usually you can work them through better understanding what is your intention, because sometimes the impact is different than the intention. And if you can get them talking about that, and then also recognizing that the fighting for the specific time and the duration of time is a red herring. There's something else going on. And if they can get to the root of that, I find parents will be a little bit more cooperative and flexible with each other.
Yeah.
I love the way you turned that around and turned it on Robert, Nicole. That was great.
Well, it's honestly, I was thinking to myself, my lawyer hat came on and I was like, well, you file. And then I was like, but that's not, there's got to be a way for them to kind of work
Right.
together. And maybe that's the first way is sort of thinking about it in a different way and in approaching it in that way. I think,
Well, and the parents will often store up resentment, right? So
yeah.
that parent who's constantly
Yes.
pushing the boundary and maybe like, stealing an hour here, a day
Mhm.
there, a weekend there, you just feel taken advantage of. And that's the underlying reaction, is that I'm not doing that to you. Why are you doing that to me? I need to set some healthier boundaries. And then that can come across as overly litigious or litigating. And then the other parent might accuse them of taking them to court anytime there's a problem. So
Right.
again, like if the co-parenting communication and trust and respect have broken down, those are going to be really hard conversations to have. You've got to rebuild that trust and that respect between the co-parents before they can exercise any sort of flexibility and
Yeah.
compassion towards one another.
Yeah, the lack of trust between co-parents is just behind so many of these issues we've talked about.
Yeah.
No
I think
trust.
people are,
Yeah.
so many people just plan for, they're just grabbing as much evidence as they can every
Yes.
single day. They may have zero intent to go back to court, but
Right.
they still want to make sure that they're calculating every wrong that this other parent did. Just to have it just in case. It's very weird. It's just case building for zero reason.
And they
Yeah.
hold on to it. A lot of times as a parenting coordinator, I'll see a dispute and I'm like, this is not a big dispute. There was some confusion. Let's resolve it. But that's not really the problem. The problem is that over the last, year, this party has been doing these other things and that really upset the one party. And now this dispute has come to the surface and a lot bigger than it needs to be because of, like, I think what Robert said, that stored up resentment, and stored up like bad acts, maybe.
Well, and especially when
No.
I'm working with one co-parent because the other one won't join co-parenting therapy or coaching,
Mhm.
I'll tell them like, stop putting that in emails and text to your co-parent. Put that in your journal. Like that's for you.
Yeah.
That's like sort of like store your resentments over there. Don't bombard your co-parent with text messages about, this day or that day. Then if they accumulate to a certain level, then maybe engage an attorney or figure out what you're going to do from a legal standpoint. But your co-parent doesn't need a text message every time they did something wrong. It just invites a counter reaction. It increases tension in the co-parenting.
Yeah.
So you have to be diplomatic and sort of decide which things you want to push and what things you can just sort of sit on for a while.
Right.
But Robert, they need to know.
Yes.
Do they? Do
Do
they?
they?
And that's one of the things I think parenting coordinators, that's one of the values of them. A lot of times I will have people tell me, I'm really upset about this happened. And I feel like it's a way for them to put it on me or tell me about it. So they're not telling the other party and they're not
Yes.
taking it out on them. So sometimes I can't help them as the parenting coordinator. Maybe it's not within my scope, but I can be a sounding board so that they don't have that, it's the other party doesn't get the brunt of it, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to have your intent. You have to know your intent. If your intent is to co-parent with someone as easily as possible, then there's times where you're just going to have to suck it up, and you might get frustrated and it might be difficult, but for the kids' sake, you suck it up. If your plan is to build a case to take them to court, then that's a totally different ball game, and
Right.
you do need to mark those things down and calendar them and put them in your timeline or whatever. But if the goal is to get along and do what's in the best interest of the child and try and just get through stuff, you sometimes have to change your own attitude.
Yeah.
I can tell you, I had to change my own attitude in mine. And it was instead of letting this other person get to me, I just had to not give them that power, right? And just be like, okay, I'm thankful my kids are here. I'm good. This is not worth fighting about. This is not worth dealing with. I just want to have a really good, time with my kids.
It's just like parenting, guys. I mean, the best parenting advice was always pick your battles.
Yep.
Right.
It's a lot like parenting.
And I get that question a lot, like, why do I need therapy or why does the child need therapy? I think you hit it on the head there in a way, Lonnie, because that is really hard to do, to change sort of the way you've been doing things for your whole life and the way you've been approaching conflict and how you've prioritized, these different things. And that's one thing that I think therapists can really help with is teaching you the tools to do that, because it is really hard as we become adults to change who to make those big changes,
Right.
handling these types of disputes.
So what are you guys going to do with this spark? Are you going to write maybe a little thin book about it? Like, are you going to have another booklet that maybe we can, pass around to people that, it doesn't need to be quite as big as this one, but I think it's like if we have, like if you, almost like a rubric that you could give to people with, again, I'm a fan of your examples. So, I mean, you guys go both, maybe you could just do a book of that, but if you took the Spark book and maybe, I just think it would be very useful for parents to have that in a divorce. Like what can they get besides looking at our podcast? Is there a piece of paper that they can...
It's a great idea, because I like the idea of people. It really is almost like a checklist. Like, we want them to go through all of their provisions and apply this to it. It's hard because everyone is so different and all their needs and their provisions are going to be so different.
Right. We didn't even touch on the biggest, and I don't want to get into this, but one of the biggest areas, you know what I'm going to say, don't you, Nicole?
Yeah.
Telephone calls between
Yes.
the parent
almost
doesn't
did.
have the kid. No.
You can't drop that and then not talk about it.
Well,
so
okay,
can we just
but
spend a moment?
I almost
Do we
did,
have
and I waited.
Do we have another 90 minutes to talk about
Yes,
that?
you can talk. Well, Nicole has, I think, 20 minutes.
Well, what I'm talking about here is, at least as a parenting coordinator and often as an attorney, one of the biggest disputes we have is, when does the parent who doesn't have the kids get to talk to them on the phone? For how long? What are the parameters of FaceTime? Who sets the call? Where does the call take place? Can the child be doing during the call? Can the call take place in the backseat of a car? Can it take place in a restaurant? Can it take place outside by the pool? I could go on and on and on. The disputes are so wide. And this does fall in the kid-focused end of things.
Yes.
Because my first question on these calls always is, does the child need this call with the parent, the other parent? Or is the child being interrupted unnecessarily to talk with the other parent? Does there need to be a call every night? Does there need to be a call every third day? I can't answer these questions, but I'm bringing it up in the context of kid-focused and just one of the biggest disputes we see. Are these calls taking place for the kid or for the parent?
But I think so, yeah. I think so many of the phone calls are really for the parent and not for the kid. As a parent with a younger child, my daughter's 11. I mean, if I getting my daughter to be on the phone with me beyond like a 2 second, call, because it's
Right.
mostly text anyways, is a challenge. And she's a super verbal kid. And that's just, I think it's, kids this age too, they're
And
not really talking on the phone. And
take
these
a
parents want
four-year-old.
30-minute calls with their kids. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, take a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old and try to keep them on the phone for 10 minutes. Oh my gosh.
Or on the
Yeah,
other end of that spectrum, a teenager who would much rather be talking to their friends or boyfriends or
right.
girlfriends. I've never found a case where I've been convinced that it hasn't been about the parent.
Hmm.
And it's so hard to get parents in that mindset of what sort of lessons are you teaching the kids? Because the
Right,
intent, I think, their intent and idea and aspiration behind this is to remain bonded with your child and to
right.
sort of keep that connection warm and there's a reciprocity in the relationship, but there's also something on the flip end of that. How long can your child, and I'll use the word reasonably here, but how long can they reasonably go without speaking to you? And is there a
Right.
benefit to having them allow time and space between the two, non-visiting parent and the child to generate something different? Maybe it's like missing them or warmth, and then it makes the connection you have with them all that much stronger when you see them, at the risk of, or I would say to the benefit of not interrupting the other parent's parenting time.
Right.
So I am going to give
It's
an example of mine
okay.
because mine was, I don't, we probably said reasonable parenting time. Again, it was a really crappy parenting plan. I asked my kids at some point because I knew that their dad didn't like the phone calls coming in. And I didn't need the phone calls. Let them have their time. I found sometimes when he called, they were very intrusive at the times, and my kids would like get up from the dinner table and go into the phone into their room because they were so anxious about not answering when he called. Um, so I asked them, I'm like, guys, do you care if I call? Like, are you all right if I don't call daily? Like, can I just, do you want the phone calls? Do you want to call me? Like, what's the easiest way? And they're like, we want you to call. And so I called on like the middle of we did 5225. I called once max on the middle of the 5 days.
Hmm.
And that
Mhm.
was it because it was a lot for them. Their dad didn't want to hear my name in their house. Um, it was stressful for them, but they still wanted me to call. So I sort of felt like I was in the middle of a rock and a hard place because I don't want them to think I don't care and that I'm not there for them if they need it. But on the other hand, it did cause tension. Um, Whenever I wrote parenting plans, I really tried really hard to not make it any more than like never on exchange days
Right.
and really in a 5225 one time on the off day on in the middle. Like that was because
Guys, I have seen a number of plans lately that say the non-custodial parent can call twice a day. And it's in the plan.
It's so
And
disruptive,
and that includes exchange days. So
oh,
literally when the kid is going to see both parents, one parent can, and it's really problematic. I mean,
I think it's crazy. You think about how busy kids are today.
right,
My
right,
kid, it's like sports. She's got, this, she's got tutoring, she's got this, she's got that. I mean, by the time, we have any time together, I probably get a half an hour a day with her. And then you're going to use that half an hour a day for a phone call?
right.
Like that does
especially like
not, I mean,
reading a story to somebody in bed, like a bedtime story to a kid,
yeah.
you get those and it's like they're taking up the whole like our nighttime routine.
Right.
Um,
You
Yeah.
know, I
So,
have had situations and where babies have and Annette's gonna know what I'm gonna say. Babies have had
right,
the court has ordered babies to have FaceTime calls,
right.
like as in infants. Because there is some research, and I guess I'm throwing this back at I'm not trying to do it, Robert, but I guess there is some research that indicates that these calls can have value for the younger children to hear the other parent's voice, especially if they're not like living in the state. as an example. So, that
And
may
I get
be,
that. I get that.
yeah,
And I can also get it from the non-custodial parent standpoint that he or she would like to see the newborn or the 18-month-old or whatever for a few minutes. But
yeah.
when these calls get into 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, that's where they get really problematic because there's just
The 18 month, are they chasing them around with the
ex-
phone?
Yeah.
exactly. That's the
Well,
problem.
and Robert, is there like I mean, there is benefit, right, for some phone calls, or I mean, like, I don't know if you know this, but like according to the research, or is it just fairly kid specific or
I'll have to do a deeper dive into the actual
yeah,
literature to know what they're saying about these video-based calls. I would say it's probably true of anything when you're looking at the benefit and drawback. You have to do a cost-benefit analysis.
right.
We have research on screen time and stimulation and overstimulation, right, in younger children. But then you're also trying to offset that with keeping a bonded relationship, healthy and attached. So does one offset the other? You have to look at the context, you have to look at the child, their developmental needs. There's so many factors. I don't think it'll ever be a one size fits all. The way I try to encourage co-parents to act is, what would you have done if you were in an intact family or still together? If dad or mom or the other parent or even a grandparent called, you'd probably spend a few minutes trying to facilitate that and maybe let the kid talk for a few minutes, but you wouldn't put any pressure on it, right?
Yeah.
On either end. That takes a special kind of co-parenting relationship post-separation and divorce to be able to facilitate things in that way. But again, when you're trying to encourage values and facilitate something that's aspirational, you can work with parents on that level. I just find when people let their guard down and they don't put so much pressure on each other, when it happens and it's great. And when it doesn't, nobody throws a fit. And so I
Mhm.
think those are the dynamics that really benefit kids.
So,
Yeah, and
right. So then
speaking
what do
to
you
that,
write?
oh,
What do
well, I
you
was gonna
write
say,
then?
speaking of that, like if you think about camps, we were talking about camps right before this, Lonnie. Kids, a lot of kids go to camps where there is no phone calls
Right.
allowed. Their
For a
parents
week or
have a
2 weeks.
visit,
Right.
Yeah.
maybe one or two visits, but they're going 2 weeks without talking, to one parent or even more, and they're fine. That's
And
what's going on in intact
there's a
families.
reason the camps have those
Yeah,
restrictions on phone calls. It's
Right.
because
right.
the camps know what's going on.
Well, and
Yeah,
let's be realistic. There's very few parenting time schedules that you'll go a significant amount of time without seeing your kid. I mean,
Exactly.
maybe 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off in the summer, or maybe a longer vacation if it's a non-custodial parent where they get summers. And then we need to talk about, how do you maintain that connection? But
Absolutely.
I mean, you can go a week without talking to your kid, in my opinion. I mean,
Yes. Yes. Well, boy, don't say that to some parents.
yeah,
But yeah, it's a big problem. And obviously, if the parents agree and they could have 5 phone calls a day. And if the
right.
parents both agree on it and aren't arguing about it, that's great. That's wonderful. We're only talking about the cases where the parents have brought that dispute to their attorneys, co-parenting coaches, or the court.
yeah.
Right.
Well, you guys, I have 1,000 other questions for you, so I think we probably need to do another one of these because there's so many more questions I have. Like I have questions um, on, besides the phone calls, what about the texting and what about the playing games with each other? And,
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
what about the location devices? And there's so many questions that we could really address on this that are so important. And what about the kid who does need the parent more frequently? And
Hmm.
is that okay? And what about the one that calls at midnight because they need to talk to their kid right then? There's so many things that really we almost need a regular parenting coordinator plan
Hmm.
podcast with you
Hmm.
guys.
Well, I think,
Yeah.
Lonnie, if we
Sure.
did a segment on communication and contact, that would could be its own podcast for sure.
Right. And devices,
Yeah.
that could easily be its own session.
Yeah.
Sounds great. I've learned a lot, guys. This was really interesting for me.
We are so
Yeah.
grateful
Thank
to have
you.
had you both on Split Up and sharing your wisdom and your experience, and then of course this really helpful framework and approach to developing parenting plans. So thank you so much.
And we will just keep working on it, Lonnie, thanks to your Enthusiastic support.
Yeah,
Yeah, this was a
thank you,
lot of
'cause I
fun.
could use
Thank
that.
you.
And
Yeah.
again, I'm going to put the link to this book. It'll be down in our information section of the podcast and the YouTube. So you can click on the link down below and get that book if you don't have it. And then hopefully they'll write something on the Spark method. But thank you again for being here, ladies.
Thank you.